Lots of interesting comments on the chats. I'm sorry for those of you who were not able to see the subtitles at the beginning. It seems like everyone's subtitles got worked out in the end. But if you missed something because of subtitles and you want to rewatch, please feel free to send us a note, and we can send you the link so that you can watch the film with the subtitles. The Q&A box is a good place to post questions or comments. And we have one question already, but I want to kind of pass to Professor Attridge to see if you had any comments that you wanted to make.
Well, just briefly, it's interesting to compare this with what we looked at a week or so ago in our webinar on the Camino. I think we were looking at a lot of the cultural sites that one sees on the way, especially walking the French way. And so we saw some of the major cathedrals at Burgos and Leon, as well as some of the small towns along the way. So we were looking at a slightly different take on the Camino. During the conversation after that show, however, there was one question that got into, I think, what this film is all about. And I think we started to have a conversation about it before the power broke down. And that was really about what the experience of walking on the Camino is for people. And this film, I think, is a film that, although the translation was a little rough, I think it conveyed a notion of what many people experience in walking on the Camino, an opportunity to divest oneself of ordinary engagements, to focus on one's interior life, one's connection with the ultimate, wherever that ultimate is to be found, within nature or beyond nature. And to come back then to an ordinary reality, somehow deepened and transformed by the experience of walking on the Camino. Not everybody who goes on the Camino looks for that experience, and people articulate that experience in different ways. But it is an important part of the tradition of walking the Camino, that is a spiritual exercise of divestment and focusing and reintegration. So I think this film brought out that dimension of the pilgrim's experience rather nicely.
All right, we have a couple of questions. Joseph Freeman is raising his hand. Joseph, if you have a question, actually I may try, because we're a small enough group that we can possibly get away with this, small being about 100 of us. So I say that with a bit of relativity. So I may try, Joseph, to open your mic if you would like to verbally ask your question. I'm gonna go to the first question that came in, which is from Timothy, who says, why is the scallop shell the symbol of the pilgrimage?
Shall I take a crack at that?
Yes.
Any symbol takes on new and different meanings as a tradition develops. But I think one of the basic facts here is that scallops are a feature of life in the northwest corner of Spain. And it's one of the things that people would come to have for lunch or for dinner when they finish their pilgrimage in Compostela. So I think it became a symbol of the goal of the pilgrimage in a rather natural way. It was simply associated with that area, and then it came into our cuisine as coquille Saint-Jacques, right? A French take on scallops that they learned to make and to have by walking the Camino. The shell of the scallop also provides a nice form of an arrow. You can see the different lines converging and pointing in a single direction, and that in many ways was taken to be a symbol of the many paths that finally converged and led to the focal point of the whole experience, the cathedral there at Compostela. So there's a natural dimension to it, there's a symbolic dimension to it, and other people can read in all sorts of other meanings into it, but it came with the territory.
Okay, great. So a couple of other questions coming in about the possibility of doing a trip and what that would be like. And I want to answer those questions in a minute. First, I'm going to go to Joseph. Joseph, I'm going to try to open your mic and allow you to, since you've raised your hand, to ask your question live. So you would just have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
There you go. All right. What's your question?
I'm interested. I've visited various places along the road, but I'm interested as to where people generally feel it begins, and we all know where it ends. I've been to Santiago de Compostela, I've been to Burgos, I've also been to Vézelay, and I'm wondering if there's any sort of official start point nowadays, or if one can just join where one wishes.
Let me take a crack at that again. There are different ways to get to Compostela. The way that the Yale pilgrimage or study tour went was on the French way, which is probably the most traveled way. And it starts at Roncesvalles in the Pyrenees and goes 790 kilometers west, touching most of the main sites, some of the ones that you mentioned, Burgos, Lyon, Logroño, etc. So that's the way that a lot of people go. And it's the way that funneled a lot of people from France through the ages. There's a 12th century pilgrim's guide, the so-called Codex Calixtinus, one book of which talks about going from France, and it's basically going along the French way. And so people have been traveling that way for a good long time, but it's not the only way. There's a way up from Portugal, there's a way up from Madrid, there's a way along the coast, the so-called English way. And if you've been to Saint Sebastian or Bilbao, you've probably seen some portions of that way. There's also a very short way that comes from A Coruña, up in the northwest corner of Spain, and that's the Irish way. And it is the shortest route that one can take to get a pilgrim's certificate at the end of the trip. Normally you have to go 100 kilometers, and so you start walking from Lyon at least, and that's where most of these ways converge, leading into Compostela. But the Irish way comes directly down from the north coast. And because of some agreement between the bishops of Compostela and the Irish bishops, that was guaranteed to be a pilgrim's way too. So there are many ways to get to Compostela, and many people choose to take more than one if they make the trip more than once.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joseph, for your question. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in about whether the Camino is still happening during this period despite the pandemic, and if Yale Alumni Association is planning a walk in the next year. And another question is, have you led non-religious alums for the trip? I'm interested in doing it, but I wonder what non-religious folks' experiences are like. And I want to take that in two parts and say, yes, the Camino is most likely there are people who will be walking the Camino as Spain opens up and allows people to do so. The challenge more for Yale alumni in offering a Camino trip is more the issue of Americans being able to travel overseas and arrive in countries without having to quarantine or without being turned away. So we're still in a period of time where border crossings are not reliable. And until that subsides, it's difficult to plan a trip. Having said that, our intention is to offer a trip next fall on the Camino. We're still working through what some of the details would be, but generally our trips are in the length of 10 to 14 days and would involve some walking as well as, being transferred to different locations along the route in a coach, bus type of situation. And if you want to see a little bit of highlights of that, Professor Attridge did a wonderful webinar for us last week on the Walking the Camino, and showed some pictures and gave a lot of commentary about what it was like to take Yale groups. I do want to address, ask Professor Attridge to address the question of non-religious alums, because the focus of the film obviously was one person's vantage point on the experience of walking the Camino, and a lot of commentary that the artist gave on the significance of it to her as a religious person. And I think it speaks to different ways that you look at pilgrimages. So I would love to sort of pose the question of how people experience pilgrimages differently, and what it might be like to do the walk as a religious person versus as a non-religious person. Because of course, when we offer alumni programming, it is offered from the perspective of all welcome, all viewpoints welcome.
Yeah, let me comment on that briefly. First of all, on the last point, what the Yale experience was like, and then more generally on the experience of pilgrimage. I somewhat facetiously refer to the Yale trip as a tourgrimage, where we're doing a little bit of walking each day, but then hopping on a nice bus and getting to the next parador in time for the afternoon cocktail hour. So it's not exactly the kind of ascetical experience that the artist was describing here that goes back to the origins of pilgrimage, where you're divesting yourself of everything. No, there's a study tour dimension to what the Yale trip is like. Now, that said, even on that trip, and the 2 times that I've done it with Yale alums, there was quite a range of attitudes and quite a range of expectations among the people who were on the trip. Some of them were focused primarily on the artistic and cultural dimensions of what we were looking at. Some of them were wrapped up in the phenomenon of a religious experience and wanted to taste it at least, even if they weren't fully committed to it. And some people, I think, did the trip as a form of pilgrimage, with their own spiritual goals and dimensions. Now, that combination is not unusual. If you read anything to do with any kind of pilgrimage, any place, you generally see a wide variety of motives and attitudes toward the experience. Think about the Canterbury Tales. Or if you haven't seen the movie, you might want to look at The Way with Martin Sheen, done about 15 years ago, which describes the experience of a man whose son went on the Camino with a religious intent, apparently, and fell and was killed. And so this fellow gathered his son's ashes when the body was brought back and cremated, and wanted to bring them to be scattered at the end of the Camino in Finisterre. And on the way, he encountered a half a dozen other people, all of whom were walking the Camino for a wide variety of reasons. And their reasons for doing so changed as they walked. And that is often the experience, even I think on the Yale trips, that some people go for the cultural experience and then find a religious dimension to it. And some go for the religious dimension and find a lot of culture that they didn't experience. So the answer is not simple, and the phenomenon of pilgrimage isn't simple either. So.
All right, there you go. Dalam, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, wants to know, is the Camino Primitivo a different route than the French route that you referred to?
The French way is the way through Spain. The Camino Primitivo that they were talking about, I believe, is the road that leads up to the French way in Spain through France. Many of the sites that you were seeing at the beginning of this film are not sites that you would see on the Yale trip, which is totally within Spain. So that's what I think she was referring to.
And I'll say that with the Yale trips, there is always an opportunity for variety and planning. So someone had asked whether next fall means fall 2021, and yes, it does mean fall 2021. The nice thing about that is that we have the opportunity to receive your feedback. So, if you're interested in doing the Camino, it gives us a chance to hear from you what you would like to do, what you would like to see, and work to see how we can incorporate that kind of feedback into the walk. So we've gotten a lot of good questions, and in the couple of minutes that we have left, I just wanted to point to some of the comments that came up in the chat. Some of you may be looking at the chat. I'm not sure if you all see it, but Penelope had mentioned that there are about 200 people arriving in Santiago each day. That's been the case for the past week or so. And Linda had mentioned that she has a friend from Ireland who's walking on the French Way right now. The other thing that I wanted to just point out is James mentioning that the spirituality as an important focus on the Camino for him. So I think it's also interesting to look at the different cultures, because for me, what I found interesting about this film was the perspective of a person from South America traveling to Spain to walk a Spanish route, and really bringing in and the artist who created the documentary being from Uruguay, bringing in sort of a transatlantic view. So I wonder, Harry, if you have any thoughts about different cultural viewpoints on the Camino, both from the Spanish-speaking world and the French world, and how that compares to how we look at it as Americans.
No, I think you find the same general range of attitudes toward what the Camino is and is about, wherever you're coming from. Some people taking it much more seriously as a religious, personal, spiritual experience, and some people looking at it more as a physical challenge or a cultural opportunity. And there are people with all of those attitudes on the Camino every day.
All right, great. Let me see. I think that we've got Dina, who wanted to know if children are allowed. And that's an interesting question, because previously we have not done it as a family trip, but doesn't mean that we couldn't do it as a family trip. I wonder.
We've lost you. Hello.
It looks like we lost Lauren. Just to continue on what she was saying about family trips, is we haven't done a family trip on the Camino in the past, but we would be open to possibly planning something like that if there was large interest. And we've never said that children can't go on our trips. They're open to anyone, families, and whatnot. Harry, would you like to add anything?
Just on that point, the two trips that I participated in for the Yale Alumni Association involved about 7 miles of walking each day, and everybody was informed about that ahead of time. So that would be the one thing to keep in mind if you're going to have children. Are they going to be able to walk that amount, or are they going to be in carriages or something? So there has to be some planning for that. But I don't see any reason not to have children go if they're up for it.
Great, thank you, Harry. And then I'm just seeing in the chat, someone asked, for those of us who have missed the previous webinar, is there a recording? And yes, there is. I saw Barb, you just posted the link in the chat. It is on our website, alumnitravel.yale.edu. And if you go to Academy Courses, you can click on Webinars on Demand and see all of our webinars on demand. Harry, do you want to have any closing comments? Because it looks like there are no more questions, but Lauren is popping back in. But if you would like to finish with any remarks.
Maybe Lauren would like to say something, and then I'll have a final farewell.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, everyone. I got temporarily Wi-Fi hiccup that disconnected me. So people want to see last week's webinar, and we can post that in the chat here. We can also email the link to all of you who wanted to see the webinar for last week. So more than happy to do that. I also invite you to email us if you're interested in the Camino and you have thoughts or questions about how the trip would be organized. When I got kicked off the internet, we were talking about whether or not families could walk on the Camino, and I think that that's a really interesting idea to consider, whether or not we would do a family trip. So yeah, and we will send you, those of you who couldn't see the subtitles, we will send you a link to the film with the subtitles. I do want to note that we had a native Spanish speaker on the call who sort of echoed the comments about the translation. Translations are always challenging, so you know, just kind of recognize that the translation may need help, and sorry about that. And with that, I just want to thank you all for attending. And I don't know, Professor Attridge, if you wanted to say anything before we go.
No, just bon Camino. If anybody takes up the opportunity to go with you the next time, it's a great experience.
Wonderful. Yes, and yes, there is a possibility of viewing today's film again. So we'll send the link out to everyone so that you can watch it again if you would like to. All right, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you at the next Alumni Academy event.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.